Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Trinity. My name is Chooks. Today, we're going to be exploring the research integrity, commercialization of research, and what that looks like in the Asia Pacific as we know it today. With me in the house today is Dan Barr and Dr. David Late. Can we maybe both give us a little bit about what you do at RMIT, your research focus, and what actually excites you about the work you do? We'll start with David.
Thank you so much, Chuck. My name is David. I am the Senior Coordinator of Research Integrity Governance at RMIT University, and my background is in humanities. So my PhD is in, modern history, and I also have a bit of experience in human research ethics, which is the way that researchers go about collecting information from people. From that background, I sort of come to research integrity, this idea of responsible and trustworthy research, which we'll talk about today. What's really exciting is, supporting researchers and helping researchers to think about doing their research in really high quality and responsible ways, and of course working with Dan.
Good segue to you, Dan.
Hi, thanks, Chooks. I'm Dan. I'm the Principal Research Integrity Advisor at RMIT. I have the pleasure of serving on the governing board of the World Conferences on Research Integrity and being involved in research on research integrity across the Asia Pacific, which is a focus of mine, as well as being able to be involved in policy, education and training and other support approaches here at RMIT for responsible and ethical research. What excites me, I will reciprocate. It's working with great people such as David, including David. But also, I think what's really exciting is what's next for research integrity. There's a great challenge in research integrity in how it supports really great research and how we could potentially prevent really common breaches from plagiarism to losing data. And I think we have lots of good ideas and seeing those getting implemented and used by researchers and helping to underpin great positive impact in our research is what excites me.
Beautiful. Really good to meet you both. Today, we're exploring research integrity and the commercialization of research and looking at the Asia Pacific context. My first question goes to David. How do you describe the term research integrity, and what does that entail for researchers in academia at the moment?
When we talk about research integrity, particularly with researchers and whatnot, we talk about this idea of adhering to a bunch of principles that make research trustworthy. And that's a really key thing, not just for researchers and for people in academia, but for the community at large. I mean, we all benefit from research, and I think it's sort of obvious at the moment as we all mostly enjoying the benefits of a very quickly developed vaccine for COVID-19. It's really vital that the knowledge created through research is trustworthy. And that's what research integrity tries to do, is try and underpin the trustworthiness of research by setting out a bunch of principles that help improve the quality and the positive impact of that research. So what that means for researchers in academia, particularly the Australian context, is reflecting on existing guidelines, existing principles and responsibilities around research, and trying to embody those in their own research. We may be able to speak a little bit later about how those principles are reflected in other jurisdictions around the Asia Pacific.
Talking about the pandemic, you were just talking about COVID. The question goes to you, Dan, is how has the pandemic itself impacted research integrity, and generally the research integrity, the research practices in Asia Pacific?
Well, almost immediately, a whole group of us, researchers, research managers, administrators, everyone had to have our lives changed dramatically, particularly when there were physical distancing and other interventions to control the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic virus. And so this immediately changed how a lot of research is done, especially involving collaborative teams where they were working together in person before, working in laboratories where you couldn't access things anymore, and particularly working with human participants. And so we had to rapidly, and I think quite in some cases very successfully, move to an online environment, a remote environment. And so one of the great challenges for us at RMIT and our team was to how do we support responsible research remotely? How do we deliver guidance? How do we deliver the provision of education and training? How do we do investigations if things go wrong remotely? And what we found actually generally, by and large, it's actually been easier in some cases for us to do these, to execute these sorts of work remotely as compared to how we were doing it previously in the face-to-face. What you can tell in terms of changes to research is that there was a rapid change in how researchers are communicating and disseminating their work. There was a huge and rapid shift to using preprint platforms as opposed to traditional peer review processes. So for across a wide variety of disciplines who are now looking at COVID-19 pandemic, or even if they weren't, researchers were accessing these platforms, putting their work out there, rapidly disseminating it before peer review, and then going into the peer review space. And so there's a huge explosion in work and research work that's been done on the COVID-19 pandemic immediately. And so, early 2020, regardless of discipline, really, across a wide range of disciplines, people were researching the pandemic. And one of the research integrity challenges that we're still trying to better understand, trying to come to terms with, are things such as, well, how has this changed peer review? How has this changed publication practices? And also, how has this changed the amount of rigor or carefulness people place in their work, given that they've rapidly wanted to and rapidly needed to study COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps using methodologies or approaches that weren't really well suited to those questions. And so the question of rigor and trustworthiness in research into COVID-19, into the pandemic, is a key one and something that we need to really get a good sense of.
Just piggybacking on one of the things you pointed out there, the need for collaboration, especially in remote settings. For edtech companies, is how do we best support that space? To David, would you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, there were some trends, or what are the key trends in the research integrity space, and what should edtech companies be looking out for or preparing themselves for?
Definitely echo Dan's comment about the changes to review of research outputs simply through just the volume of research that's being published and the reliance on preprint presses. That's a big trend from the pandemic. But I guess a longer term trend in research integrity is this shift from very rules-based documents or rules-based guidelines about responsible research and doing research in a trustworthy way to these principle-based guidelines documents like we have now. So that does require quite a bit more reflection of researchers. They're not looking for a particular rule to say you should do this, you should not do that. It sets out some very high-level things that researchers strive for with mixed degrees of success. So how that's done depends on a lot of different things. I'm not sure exactly what that does mean for edtech companies, except that there is a space where researchers are thinking about these things in a more principles-based way than before. Maybe being able to reach researchers through those kinds of principles, through those responsibilities that they have, may be something for edtech companies to consider. I'm not certain.
Thanks for sharing that. Dan, and I think you already mentioned a little bit of the challenges we're seeing in the research integrity space in Asia Pacific. Would you, in addition to the need, or one of the needs in terms of having a space where people can work collaboratively and still do the same amount of research, what are some other challenges we should be aware of in Australia and in the Asia Pacific as a whole?
That's a great question. I think there's always been a question of, well, how can research integrity enable or make better collaborations and researcher mobility, researcher connections? This was I think a question that came out of the World Conferences on Research Integrity when this conference was based in Montreal and the creation of things like the Montreal Statement, which is guidance document, guidance material for researchers and some for institutions about, well, if you're going to go into collaborative research across various different boundaries, what are the things you need to look out for? So what are the principles, but what are then in turn, what, like David's mentioned, responsibilities and practices to enable great, trustworthy collaborations so you can get that really, really great outcomes from the research. And these are things such as discussing, planning and agreeing on how data will be kept, discussing, planning and then agreeing on where will you publish or communicate your research, and sorting out things such as authorship and navigating, I think, authorship, planning for data, planning for where you publish, planning methodologies. The pandemic and our online connectivity now has made this a little bit easier, but there's still this asymmetry in, I think, some economies where there's research sectors quite well developed. I'm thinking of the Asia Pacific, and an asymmetry to those with where it's less well developed. And I think some of our work has looked at, well, what are the principles that are key for everyone to consider, to reflect upon when you're thinking about cross-cultural or cross-boundary collaborations. And one of them is to think about the principle of diversity. Think about, well, how do I make sure that we address or try to manage asymmetries in people's expectations, or how they might approach things, or how they can even resource work, and how that then plays out in research integrity at the end of with the publication and its impact, I think is something that's quite interesting and a challenge for us. How do we manage expectations across borders, across boundaries, and across cultures? Starting with a set of principles that everyone sort of agrees on, and then working through them using tools such as planning tools is one way we could see that at least being addressed in a good way.
Hey, with thanks for calling that out. I just had a thought with regards to the pandemic and all the challenges we just discussed in the research integrity space. David, would you say that researchers in academia still have some pain points? It did sound from one of Dan's elaboration there that the pandemic came with the amount. It sort of increased the number of research. A lot of people going into research. That could be a good thing. But for a researcher, what would you say were the pain points?
I guess in a way, similar to my previous response, there's a shorter term thing that comes from the pandemic, which exacerbates a longer term pain point that researchers have had, and particularly in Australia during the pandemic, there's been huge changes to staffing and funding in research institutions, and the amount of time and capacity that researchers have to actually do research, to generate that knowledge, to make that positive impact. Like I said, that's been made acute by the Australian context in the pandemic, but that also touches on a wider issue around how researchers are assessed and how they're rewarded in particularly higher education settings, but also other research institutions. And there's some fantastic work at the recent Hong Kong World Conference on Research Integrity about ways to appropriately recognize practices that researchers do, things that they do that make their research trustworthy. Things like open science, like being involved in particular committees associated with research, like peer review, for example, or ethics and research integrity advisors. These different ways to assess how well researchers are doing research and to reward those great practices. So those are some pain points that researchers may not necessarily be rewarded for doing good things, but also it's fewer resources around for researchers to do research.
It sounds like there are the flip in the way we've done research has produced opportunities for research, at the same time produced new challenges from the looks of it. The idea behind research integrity is the need for ethics in research. How early in a researcher's career is research ethics taught, and how's that framed throughout their schooling or their education? Yeah.
That's a really interesting question, because when I reflect on back in my day, Chooks, back when I did high school, and when I was learning how to do biology and chemistry, one of the things that I learnt to do really early on was to write really good records. If I reflect on it now, my lab book writing technique in high school was an early exposure and awareness raising for really good data management. Now, how well that it's translated to my studies later on and to now is very interesting. I mean, supporting researchers in responsible data management and things such as open data and data sharing are one of the big challenges for universities and for academic settings. Thinking about other aspects of research integrity, responsible or rigor and methodologies, how you might publish work, who gets to be an author, what about research ethics and the care and use of animals, or respectful interactions with human participants and maybe the environment. You could see that these things are intrinsic to research and can actually be built in to education, to science education, to research education at the earliest point. And on reflection, I think I was exposed to responsible research data management fairly early on.
That's actually quite an interesting point. David, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the same question as well.
I could speak a little more recent experience, if I may, Dan, as a researcher. The focus for what we call research integrity or research ethics in the higher education sector definitely comes to the fore when you become a research candidate. So less so while you're a undergraduate student. Maybe there's some familiarity with the concepts that eventually lead into responsible research practice, but thinking about them as a code or responsibilities that researchers have does come early in the research journey, but I guess late in the journey of developing skills and acquiring knowledge as a student. So we in particular do try to focus the education and training that we offer at RMIT for those research candidates, those people at the beginning of their research careers, but obviously also make it available to all researchers. So trying to get that knowledge or expose researchers to that knowledge and making them aware of these things as early as possible is really important.
I'm thinking of getting both your perspectives on something that's been in the media for a bit, is the idea of balancing research regulation and independent oversight in detection and investigation of research misconduct. What are your perspectives in this? I'll start with Dan this time.
Yeah, there's a bit of commentary around this and some apparent advocacy for some additional national oversight body of research integrity that actually seems to stem from a definition of research integrity that is not as broad as the one we presented earlier, probably one focused more on the negative sides of things when things go wrong. And you'll see in the commentary the use of terms such as research fraud, research misconduct, terms that have actually we've moved on a bit from in the Australian setting in the Australian Code. These are important things to address, of course, and have been addressed in very rare events when people have done the wrong thing, when people have fabricated work and defrauded grant agencies or government agencies that have funded their research. These are important things to address. What's very interesting is looking at jurisdictions where really, really quite scandalous events in research integrity have occurred. You can look to South Korea, where instead of making a national oversight body, what they did was make a national education, research integrity education body that linked institutions together. That was their approach, rather than having a policing approach to rather build out cultures. In the Netherlands, an interesting thing there is the rapid emergence of the Netherlands Research Integrity Network and the huge amount of research now going on into research integrity across institutions there. They're solving their crisis, that there are apparent problems in research integrity, by doing great research to come up with solutions. So I think we have to be really careful when we talk about an extra body, a regulatory body, a national oversight body. I think we have a lot of challenges in Australia. One of them is transparency. One of them is harmonisation. Institutions do aim to address research integrity breaches and when things go wrong. I think at the moment, the commentary and narrative suggests that institutions are trying to brush everything under the carpet and not address this. And this is certainly not the case in our experience. I think actually what might be really beneficial is if we network everyone together. All the leaders, the academics involved in investigations, our research integrity advisors, people such as David and I, and others, link us together so that we can work together on this as a group and come up with some harmonized approaches to ensure accountability, to ensure integrity in research, rather than having an extra policing step as the first response.
Thanks, Dan. David, any thoughts on this?
Just to agree entirely with Dan, emphasize this supportive, educational, networking approach rather than kicking indoors and auditing and then policing approach. But on the other hand, I was particularly impressed by one comment in the that commentary that Dan mentioned, where Australia has a national sporting integrity body, but not a research integrity body. So sort of shows the differing priorities in particular countries around the Asia Pacific.
Yeah. Oh, that's quite a funny one as well. Just goes to show where our priorities lie. Maybe sporting is more of interesting compared to research integrity. Just talking about, we've been talking a little bit about the need for collaboration across research. There was an article, and we can put this somewhere in the link as part of this conversation. In the Springer article, actually, where of the retracted papers in the last 3 decades, this is from the Web of Science core collection, most of them were multi-authored. The question here, and this goes to both of you, is how can researchers navigate the risk inherent within research collaboration projects and publication of multi-authored work? I think you slightly mentioned this earlier, Dan. So I'll pose the question to you first.
Okay, thanks. It is a real challenge, especially as interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary teams come together. So you get these large authorship listings where the nature of authorship has changed dramatically compared to what it once was. You have contributors, people who've contributed small packets of scholarly or intellectually important work to the research that's communicated, and they're able to be accountable for that piece. But in a sense, at the end, no one is able to be accountable for the whole piece. It's actually quite impossible to, because you're not from that specific discipline area, especially in these sort of large multi-author papers where there's multiple disciplines. So how do you ensure trust across an authorship listing that vast and that sort of collaborative research? It does point a little bit, I will point to the tools and planning things that we do have in place already, how well they're accessed and how well we promote them to multidisciplinary teams and utilize them and see if we can improve them. I think this is a really great challenge for us at an institution that does this kind of work. How often do people use authorship plans? Are the current plans that we provide them useful? How could they be improved? Another great challenge is data. Where are the data? Where are they stored? How are they stored across multi-institutional teams, across international teams? There's lots of approaches that solve for this. And I think one of the great things that solves for this at the end, really improves practice, is if you plan for open data sharing. So if you plan for open sharing at the end of a project, if you can, depending on the nature of your work, but if you can, you plan for it. If you're sharing transparently and fairly at the end, you're showing everyone what you did and why you're communicating your work. What are the great conclusions from the work, and you show them all the bits that have made that up. Then inherently, you have to be really good at your data management. You have to know all these answers to the questions about storage and management. And this is a really great enabler for really good, responsible research practice. And then you get to share it with everyone at the end, such that it can be used again really easily. So open research practices, planning with research integrity in mind, being a really good communicative group across disciplines. These are things we probably look to promoting and enabling.
Really good list of strategies or resources you shared there. Thanks for shedding light on that. David, any final thoughts on that as we come to a wrap up today's episode?
If I can just link back what Dan mentions to those principles that I started off this session, talking about the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research. Some of those principles that make research trustworthy are things like honesty, transparency, and fairness. So if a researcher were to reflect on those principles and embody them through an open, honest discussion with co-authors about things like authorship, about their relative contributions to a research project, that's a very fundamental and very effective way of navigating these risks around co-authorship. I suppose take it back to those principles and think about how best to embody those in the practices that researchers do every day.
Always go back to the basic principles. That's from the foundations for success. Thank you so much, Dan and David, for being on the call today. On today's episode, we've been exploring research integrity and the commercialization of research and how we want to approach being citizens of integrity as we continue on our research journey. Thank you again. And I hope everyone who's watching really enjoyed today's session.